Prepare to delve into a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Today we'll explore one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the Appalachian Mountains, a story that has remained whispered for generations, hidden in the dusty archives of Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from. Let's join you on this journey through America's dark past. It was the year 1859. The American nation was on the brink of its greatest rupture, divided between North and South, between freedom and slavery. But in the isolated Appalachian Mountains, another form of darkness thrived far from the gaze of the big cities. The roads were precarious trails cut between rocky cliffs and dense forests where sunlight rarely touched the ground. Travelers who ventured into these mountain passes often disappeared without a trace, swallowed up by the vast wilderness or by something far worse. The Appalachian region stretched like a green scar across the eastern seaboard, from Pennsylvania to Alabama, but it was in the central reaches of West Virginia that the most sinister stories found fertile ground. Their families lived in isolation for generations, developing their own codes of conduct, their own silent laws that rarely coincided with those of the civilized world. Greenbrier County, with its deep caves and hidden valleys, was particularly known for harboring communities that preferred shadow to daylight. It was in this setting that the McCallister family built their estate. The house was strategically positioned along the old road, connecting the towns of Lewisburg and White Sulphur Springs, a vital route for traders, farmers, and travelers seeking to cross the mountains. The building was modest, made of logs, blackened by time, and something else no one could yet name. 2 chimneys rose from the ends, belching thick smoke that often carried a peculiar odor, something the nearest neighbors, miles away, occasionally commented on. Samuel McCallister was the patriarch, a man of average height, with broad shoulders forged by hard work in the mountains, deep-set eyes that rarely blinked, and a gray beard that hid a perpetually downturned mouth. He had arrived in the area 2 decades earlier from some unknown place in the east, bringing with him a wife and the promise of an honest life. His wife, Martha, was an even more enigmatic figure. Tall, thin to the point of sickliness, she moved around the property like a shadow, always watching, always calculating. Together, they had created an establishment that offered rest and meals to weary travelers. The McCallisters Inn quickly gained a reputation. Some travelers praised the hospitality and the hearty meals served at reasonable prices. Others, however, whispered about the oppressive atmosphere, how the silence inside the house seemed heavier than usual, how Martha watched her guests with an intensity that made one's skin crawl. But in the Appalachian Mountains of 1859, options were scarce. Travelers in the region often had no choice but to accept any available shelter, before night fell and turned the trails into death traps. What made the McCallisters' location particularly advantageous was its isolation. The property sat in a narrow valley, surrounded by steep slopes covered in ancient pines and oaks. The road passed directly in front of the house, but it was rare to see more than 3 or 4 travelers a week during the winter months. In the spring and summer, the flow increased, but never became intense. It was the kind of place where someone could disappear and no one would notice for weeks, perhaps months. Greenbrier County records show that the McCallister family maintained a distant but cordial relationship with local officials. They paid their taxes, rarely caused visible trouble, and occasionally contributed to community festivals held in Lewisburg. Samuel was seen in town perhaps once a month, always buying basic supplies, flour, salt, tools. Martha was almost never seen. This social invisibility was common among the more isolated mountain dwellers, so no one questioned them, no one investigated, no one noticed the patterns that were beginning to form. Because there was a pattern. Lone travelers who stopped at the McCallisters Inn often didn't reach their final destination. Traders transporting valuable goods simply disappeared after a documented last stop at that isolated property. Relatives in distant towns wrote letters to local authorities, inquiring about loved ones who should have arrived weeks earlier. But in the Appalachian Mountains, disappearances were common. Accidents happened. People fell off cliffs, were attacked by wild animals, and became lost in the endless forests. Death was a constant and accepted presence. What no one yet realized was that something far more sinister was happening in that narrow valley, something that would challenge even the most prepared minds when it finally came to light, something that would transform the McCallisters' home into an eternal symbol of the evil that can flourish when civilization recedes and human darkness finds room to grow unobserved. Spring of 1859 arrived in the Appalachians, bringing with it the melting of the mountains and the return of travelers to the roads. The muddy trails began to dry under the April sun, and with them came the promise of commerce, news, and movement. It was this time of year that the routes between West Virginia towns filled with traders, farmers bringing goods to sell, families seeking new opportunities in the western lands. And it was also this time of year that the McCallisters Inn saw its busiest activity. Among the travelers passing through the region that year was a man named Thomas Harrington. He was a cloth merchant from Richmond, loading his wagon with bolts of linen, cotton, and wool, destined for the Charleston markets. Thomas was 32 years old, married, and the father of 2 children who awaited his return in approximately 3 weeks. He kept a meticulous journal of his travels, noting every stop, every transaction, every quirk along the way. This journal would be crucial to what would come next. The last entry in Thomas Harrington's diary was dated April 23, 1859. In it, he described his arrival at the McCallisters' estate at dusk, after an exhausting day traversing the steepest mountain passes. The writing was hurried, but clear. Thomas mentioned the relief of finding shelter before nightfall, described the appearance of the log house with its 2 smoking chimneys, and made a curious observation about Martha McCallister. He wrote that the woman had watched him with disturbing intensity as he unloaded his goods, and that there was something in her eyes that made him think twice about accepting her hospitality. But night was fast approaching, and the next known inn was over 15 miles away. Thomas had no choice. He never made it to Charleston. His wife, Eleanor, waited 4 weeks before sending an urgent letter to the Greenbrier County Sheriff. In it, she described her husband's usual routes, his expected arrival dates, and desperately pleaded for any information about his whereabouts. The sheriff at the time was a man named William Daniels, a veteran of the Native American Wars and a profound expert on the Appalachian Mountains. Daniels took the letter seriously and launched a discreet investigation. What the sheriff discovered when reviewing his own records was disturbing. In the past 5 years, at least 12 people had been reported missing after crossing that particular region of the mountains. 12 individuals who simply vanished between Lewisburg and White Sulphur Springs, a distance of only 25 miles. Most were men traveling alone, traders or laborers looking for work. 2 were unaccompanied couples. All carried valuables, enough money for their journeys, goods that could be sold. Daniels was a pragmatic man. He knew the mountains were treacherous, that accidents happened with frightening frequency, but 12 disappearances in 5 years on the same route was statistically improbable. Something was wrong. He began interviewing the scattered residents of the area, asking careful questions about anything unusual they might have observed. Most had nothing to report. Families lived far apart, too busy with their own survival to pay attention to their neighbors. It was then that Daniels spoke with a man named Jacob Weber. Jacob was a trapper who roamed the mountains in search of wild animal pelts, knowing every trail, every cave, every stream in the region. He lived even more secluded than the McCallisters, preferring the company of trees to that of people. But Jacob had keen eyes and a keen memory. When the sheriff mentioned the disappearances, the trapper was silent for a long moment before speaking. Jacob said he'd noticed something strange in recent years. He frequently hunted on the slopes above the McCallisters' property, and on several occasions he'd observed suspicious movement at night. He'd seen Samuel dragging large, heavy objects from the house to a barn at the back of the property. He'd seen Martha digging in a specific area of the land, even during the harsh winter, when the ground was nearly frozen. And then there was the smell. Jacob mentioned that on certain nights, when the wind was blowing in the right direction, a peculiar, nauseating odor would waft from the McCallisters' chimneys. It wasn't the usual smell of burning wood or cooking food. It was something different, something that made his stomach churn. The hunter also reported seeing abandoned wagons in distant ravines, partially hidden by branches and foliage. He had thought they were discarded vehicles from travelers who had been in accidents, but now, hearing about the disappearances, he began to question his own assumptions. Jacob offered to show the sheriff where some of these wagons were hidden. Daniels and Jacob set off together 3 days later, taking 2 deputies with them. They found the first wagon in a ravine about 5 miles from the McCallisters' property. The wagon was deliberately covered with pine boughs and dead leaves, a clear attempt at concealment. Upon closer examination, Daniels found identifying marks that matched the descriptions submitted by the family of a merchant who had gone missing the previous year. The man had been transporting farm tools and had never reached his destination. The second wagon was found even farther away, in an area so remote that it would have been impossible for anyone to stumble upon it by accident. This one belonged to a couple who had disappeared 2 years earlier. Inside the wagon, hidden under a broken seat, Daniels found personal documents, letters, and a small amount of coin. Things travelers would never abandon voluntarily. The scene suggested something terrible. People didn't simply leave their lives behind like that. Something or someone had forced them to. The sheriff knew he now had enough evidence to justify a formal investigation of the McCallisters' property, but he also knew he needed to be careful. If Samuel and Martha were indeed responsible for the disappearances, confronting them without adequate preparation could be dangerous. Daniels returned to Lewisburg and began planning his approach. He would gather more men, obtain a formal search warrant, and then visit that isolated mountain home. What he didn't yet know was that what he would find there would be far worse than any scenario his experienced mind could imagine. Meanwhile, at the McCallisters' estate, life continued its grim and routine course. The chimneys continued to emit their peculiar smoke. Martha continued to watch the road with her piercing eyes, and Samuel continued to greet weary travelers with a smile that never reached his sunken eyes. The trap remained set, waiting for the next unsuspecting victim. Sheriff William Daniels spent the next few days gathering information and preparing his team. He knew that a hasty accusation without solid evidence could result in nothing more than embarrassment for authorities and a possible escape for the suspects. The law in Appalachia in 1859 was precarious at best, and isolated families like the McCallisters often operated under their own unwritten rules. Daniels needed something concrete, something undeniable that would justify not only a search, but potentially arrests. He decided to take an indirect approach. Rather than arriving at the property with an armed team, which would certainly alert Samuel and Martha, Daniels planned a casual visit disguised as a routine patrol. He would bring along only one deputy, John Crawford, a young but observant man who knew how to maintain his composure under pressure. The strategy was simple. They would arrive at the property at noon, when travelers were most likely to be around, and ask seemingly innocent questions about missing persons, carefully observing the McCallisters' reactions. On the morning of May 12, 1859, Daniels and Crawford set out from Lewisburg on sturdy horses accustomed to the rugged mountain terrain. The drive to the McCallisters' property took approximately 3 hours, passing through dense forests where sunlight filtering through the treetops created unsettling patterns on the leaf-strewn ground. The air was thick with moisture, a harbinger of a storm brewing beyond the mountains to the west. When they finally spotted the darkened log house with its twin chimneys, both men felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The silence was deeper there, as if the forest itself avoided making noise near this spot. There were no birds singing, no movement of small animals in the undergrowth, only the sound of horses' hooves breaking dry branches under their feet and the occasional moan of the wind among the pine trunks. Samuel McCallister was outside when they arrived, repairing a section of fence surrounding a small pen where 3 pigs were feeding on something Daniels couldn't identify from a distance. The man looked up at the sound of the horses, and his face remained completely expressionless. There was no surprise, no curiosity, none of the usual hospitality one would expect from an innkeeper upon seeing visitors, just that blank, calculating look. Daniels dismounted first, followed by Crawford. The sheriff offered a cordial greeting and formally introduced himself, explaining that he was investigating reports of missing persons in the area. Samuel wiped his hands on his stained apron before shaking Daniels's outstretched hand. His palm was rough and cold, and the grip was too brief to be considered friendly. He said he had heard rumors about disappearances, but knew nothing specific personally. Travelers came and went, he explained in a monotone, and he had no way of knowing what happened to them after they left his property. It was then that Martha appeared at the door. She said nothing, just stood there watching the 3 men with that disturbing intensity that had been mentioned in Thomas Harrington's diary. Daniels noticed how her eyes moved constantly, assessing, measuring, calculating potential threats. She held a kitchen towel between her hands, twisting it repeatedly in a nervous gesture that contrasted with her perfectly controlled facial expression. The sheriff asked if he could ask a few questions inside the house, claiming it would be more comfortable for everyone. Samuel hesitated for a split second before nodding. The 4 entered the log building and Daniels and Crawford were immediately struck by a complex and unpleasant odor. There was the smell of burnt fat, of something fermenting in some dark corner, of damp and mildew. The windows were few and small, keeping the interior in perpetual darkness even during the day. The main room served simultaneously as kitchen, living room and dining area. A large fireplace dominated one wall, with iron hooks hanging over the still hot embers. Blackened pots were stacked on a side table, and makeshift shelves displayed canning jars with contents that looked several years old. The floor was made of wide wooden planks, some irregularly stained with dark substances that could have been anything from spilled wine to something far more sinister. Daniels began by asking general questions about the flow of travelers through the property. How many stopped each week? Did they keep any kind of log? Had any recent guests mentioned encountering anything unusual on the road? Samuel answered in monosyllables when possible, offering as little information as necessary. Martha remained completely silent throughout the conversation, simply observing. It was Crawford who noticed first. The young deputy had keen eyes trained to spot inconsistencies. He noticed several men's clothing items hanging on hooks near the back door, clothes of varying sizes and styles that clearly didn't belong to Samuel. There were fine wool coats, a felt hat of a higher quality than a secluded mountain couple would normally own, and well-crafted leather boots piled in a corner. When Crawford casually mentioned the clothing, asking if the McCallisters bought used items from travelers, Martha finally spoke. Her voice was surprisingly high-pitched, almost childlike, completely at odds with her physical appearance. She explained that they occasionally accepted clothing as partial payment when travelers didn't have enough money to pay for lodging and meals. It was a plausible explanation, but the way she delivered it with measured pauses and without blinking once made Crawford's stomach churn. Daniels decided to press further. He specifically mentioned Thomas Harrington, describing the cloth merchant, and asking if Samuel or Martha remembered seeing him pass through the area in April. There was a tense silence. Samuel and Martha exchanged a quick but meaningful glance, a silent communication between people sharing deep secrets. Then Samuel shook his head, saying that so many travelers passed through that it was impossible to remember them all, but Daniels had seen that look. He'd spent decades reading people, and he knew when he was dealing with liars. The problem was looks and intuition weren't enough for an arrest or even a more invasive search. He needed something concrete. He decided to try one last approach. He asked if he could see the barn at the back of the property, claiming there had been reports of an abandoned wagon that might be hidden somewhere in the area and that he was checking all the larger structures. The reaction was immediate and revealing. Samuel straightened, and for the first time his expression changed, showing something that could be interpreted as concern or suppressed anger. He said the barn was locked, and he saw no reason to open it without a formal warrant. Martha stepped forward, placing herself between the visitors and the door leading to the back of the house. Her entire body was tense, ready for action. Daniels knew he had touched something sensitive. The barn clearly held secrets the McCallisters didn't want revealed, but legally, he couldn't force entry without a court order. He thanked them for their cooperation, said he could return with more questions in the future, and signaled to Crawford that it was time to leave. The two men exited the house under Martha's watchful eye, mounted their horses, and began riding back to Lewisburg. They had barely gone a few yards when Crawford looked back one last time. What he saw chilled him. Samuel and Martha stood side by side in front of the house, watching them leave with identical expressions of calculating coldness, and behind them, through one of the small second-story windows, Crawford swore he saw movement, a shadow that shouldn't have been there in a house supposedly housing only two people. He mentioned it to Daniels, who nodded gravely. They both knew they needed to act quickly, before any evidence could be destroyed. The ride back to Lewisburg was spent in tense silence. Daniels and Crawford mentally processed everything they had observed on the McCallisters' property, every suspicious detail, every telltale reaction, every inconsistency their trained minds had picked up. The sheriff knew he had only a narrow window of opportunity. If Samuel and Martha suspected a formal investigation was underway, they would have enough time to destroy evidence or simply disappear deep into the mountains, where finding them would be virtually impossible. Upon arriving in town, Daniels went directly to the office of Judge Martin Pembroke, an elderly but perceptive man who had served Greenbrier County for over 20 years. Daniels presented everything he had discovered: the abandoned wagons, Jacob Weber's reports of suspicious nocturnal activity, the mismatched clothing and belongings found in the McCallisters' house, and especially his defensive reaction when he mentioned the barn. Pembroke listened with increasing attention, jotting down occasional notes in his leather-bound notebook. The judge was cautious by nature. He reminded the sheriff that serious charges against established citizens needed to be based on more than suspicion and coincidence. The Appalachian Mountains were full of eccentric people who lived in unusual ways, and this alone did not constitute a crime. However, Pembroke also recognized that the pattern of disappearances was too alarming to ignore. After 2 hours of deliberation, he agreed to issue a limited search warrant, allowing Daniels and a team to inspect the McCallisters' property, including the barn and any other structures on the land. Daniels knew he needed to act immediately. He gathered 6 trusted men, all experienced deputies or community volunteers who had served in local militias. Among them was Jacob Weber, whose mountain knowledge and tracking skills could prove crucial. The group prepared to set out at dawn the next day, May 13, 1859, armed not only with rifles and revolvers, but also with shovels, flashlights, and ropes, in case they needed to investigate hidden or underground areas. The night before the expedition, Daniels barely slept. His mind constantly ran through the possible scenarios they might encounter. At best, they'd discover the McCallisters were merely eccentric hoarders who illegally traded in travelers' belongings, perhaps buying stolen goods. At worst, they'd find evidence of crimes beyond the comprehension of civilized men. Something in the back of his mind told him the truth lay closer to the latter. The group set out before sunrise, taking advantage of the dim light of dawn to navigate the mountain trails. They rode in tight formation, aware that Samuel and Martha might try to resist or flee if they saw such a large force approaching. The plan was to quickly surround the property, with some men positioned in the surrounding wooded areas to prevent any escape attempts, while Daniels and the others would make the frontal approach. By the time they came within sight of the McCallisters' house, the sun was beginning to peak over the eastern mountains, casting a cold, golden light over the valley. Smoke rose from only one chimney, a sign that at least one of the residents was awake. Daniels gave the signal, and his men dispersed silently, taking up strategic positions. Jacob Weber and another tracker named Silas Grant circled the property on the north side, while 2 other deputies covered the south. Daniels, Crawford, and the 2 remaining men approached along the main road. Samuel was outside again, this time feeding chickens in a small makeshift coop. He looked up at the sound of horses, and his expression hardened immediately upon seeing the number of armed men. He didn't run, didn't shout, just stood there, holding the bucket of feed with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Daniels dismounted, held the search warrant in his gloved hand, and read it loudly, clearly, and authoritatively. Samuel listened in absolute silence. When Daniels finished, the man simply dropped the bucket, making a metallic sound that echoed through the silent valley. Martha appeared in the doorway, and this time her expression wasn't one of calculating coldness, but something more primal, something resembling fear or perhaps suppressed desperation. She looked at Samuel, and again that silent communication passed between them, an entire conversation condensed into a single glance. Daniels ordered them both to remain outside under the watchful eye of 2 deputies while he and the others conducted the search. He began in the main house, methodically examining every room, every nook, every crevice where something might be hidden. The bedrooms on the second floor were sparse and dusty, clearly little used. There was a large bed in one of the rooms, covered with patched quilts, and a wooden chest containing simple clothing. Nothing particularly suspicious at first glance. It was in the basement that the atmosphere began to change. Access was through a trapdoor in the kitchen, hidden beneath a coarse rug. When Crawford lifted the hatch, a strong, putrid odor escaped from the depths, causing several of the men to instinctively recoil. Daniels switched on a flashlight and began descending the wooden steps, which groaned under his weight. The basement was low, with an uneven stone ceiling that forced the men to walk hunched over. The space was clearly used for storage. There were barrels of preserves, sacks of grain, and rusty tools hanging from hooks on the stone walls, but there were also things that wouldn't make sense in a normal basement. Chains attached to the walls with iron rings, dark stains on the dirt floor formed unsettling patterns, and in one corner, partially covered by a waxed tarp, a pile of objects that made Daniels's heart race. He pulled back the tarp, revealing a disorganized pile of personal belongings. There were leather wallets, some still containing identification documents and small sums of money. There was modest jewelry, wedding rings, lockets with faded photographs inside. There were pocket watches, several of them still ticking until their windings had run out. And there were clothes, so many clothes, neatly folded and stacked like merchandise in a store. Crawford began to examine the documents, and with a trembling voice confirmed that several of the names matched those reported missing. Here was the wallet of Thomas Harrington, the draper. There was the locket described by the family of a farmer who had disappeared 2 years earlier. And more items kept appearing, a macabre catalogue of lives cut short. But that was just the beginning. Daniels knew that stolen belongings, no matter how incriminating, didn't fully explain what had happened to their owners. He needed to find more definitive evidence, and his instinct told him that such evidence would be in the barn, the structure Samuel had so vehemently refused to show him during the previous visit. The group left the basement and headed to the back of the property, where the barn loomed like a menacing shadow against the now clear sky. The structure was larger than it appeared from a distance, solidly built of thick planks and a roof of weather-blackened wooden shingles. A heavy padlock secured the double front doors. Daniels ordered it yanked, and with a few blows, the metal gave way, allowing the doors to slowly swing open, creaking on rusted hinges. The barn's interior was dim, with only a few rays of light filtering through cracks between the boards. Daniels raised his flashlight, and the dim light began to reveal what lay hidden within. What they saw in that initial moment would make some of the more hardened men in the group recoil in nausea, and would begin to reveal the true extent of the horror the McCallisters had perpetrated in that secluded valley. The light from Daniels's flashlight danced across the barn's interior walls, revealing a scene that defied any expectations the men might have had. The space had been divided into distinct sections, each with a specific purpose that gradually became clear as their eyes adjusted to the dim light. This wasn't simply an abandoned barn or a warehouse for stolen goods. It was something much more organized, much more deliberate. The first section, closest to the entrance, contained common farm tools: hoes, rakes, saws of various sizes, axes with handles worn from frequent use. Nothing particularly suspicious at first glance, though Daniels noticed that many of the blades were stained with a reddish rust that could have been anything. Hanging from hooks on the ceiling beams were ropes of varying thicknesses, some with elaborate knots at the ends, others cut to specific lengths as if measured for specific purposes. The second section was more disturbing. There was a large work table made of thick planks, its surface marked by countless deep cuts and scratches. Beside the table, wooden barrels were lined up against the wall, some open and empty, others sealed with lids held together by ropes. The smell emanating from that area was complex and nauseating, a mixture of salt, vinegar, and something sweet and putrid that made his eyes sting. Crawford had to step outside momentarily for fresh air. Jacob Weber, who had remained at a distance observing the property, entered the barn and immediately identified what the barrels contained. He explained that he recognized the salting and preservation process hunters used to preserve meat during long journeys. The barrels contained brine, a concentrated salt solution used to prevent decay, but the scale of what lay before them was absurd for any normal household need. There were at least 20 barrels of varying sizes, many of them large enough to hold enormous quantities of material. Daniels ordered the sealed barrels opened. What they found confirmed their worst fears, but in a way none of them were fully prepared to process. The barrels contained preserved evidence that left no doubt about the fate of the missing travelers. These were not complete discoveries, but fragments, pieces that had been carefully prepared and stored as if they were merchandise. The realization of what they were seeing took a few moments to solidify in the minds of the men present. One of the deputies, a farmer named Robert Hayes, who had volunteered to help with the search, fell to his knees and vomited violently. Another man, a veteran of border conflicts, simply staggered out of the barn and sat on the ground outside, his head in his hands. Daniels, though deeply shaken, forced himself to maintain his composure. He needed to document everything, needed to understand the full extent of what had happened there. In the third section of the barn, they found what could only be described as a processing area. There were more tables, these with gutters carved into the edges for draining liquids. Knives of various sizes were meticulously arranged on a wooden rack. Butcher's hooks hung from the rafters, some still with fragments of rope attached, and there were records, leather-bound notebooks where Martha McCallister had kept meticulous accounts of her activities. Crawford, who had returned after regaining his composure, began to sift through the notebooks with trembling hands. What he found was both meticulous and utterly terrifying. Martha had recorded dates, physical descriptions, valuables, and even personal assessments of every victim who had passed through her property. The records stretched back 7 years, far longer than Daniels had initially estimated. There were entries for at least 23 different people, each documented in cold clinical detail. The notes revealed the McCallisters' methods with disturbing clarity. They carefully selected their victims, preferring lone travelers carrying valuable possessions who were unlikely to be immediately sought after. Samuel offered hospitality, Martha prepared meals, and at some point during the night, when the victims were vulnerable, asleep, or weakened, the McCallisters struck. The notebooks did not detail the exact methods used, but references to nighttime preparation and transfer to the barn left little to the imagination. What shocked Daniels and his team most was the cold rationality behind it all. There were no signs of delusional insanity in Martha's records. There were no twisted religious justifications or proclamations of divine missions. It was simply a calculated crime, executed with efficiency and careful planning. The McCallisters had turned the murder into a quasi-commercial operation, extracting value from their victims in multiple ways before eliminating all the evidence they could. And it was then that Daniels fully understood the meaning of the whispered title that would eventually become associated with this case. The McCallisters didn't just rob and kill. They had found an additional use for their victims, a way to reduce evidence while simultaneously feeding themselves during the long mountain winters when game was scarce and supplies were limited. The peculiar smoke Jacob Weber had mentioned, the strange odor Thomas Harrington had recorded in his diary, the large pots always boiling in the house's fireplace, all took on a new and horrifying meaning. Martha's notebooks even contained recipes, preparation methods she had apparently perfected over the years. There were references to surplus stock that was salted and stored in barrels for future use. There were notes on which seasonings worked best to mask unusual flavors. There was even an entry where she lamented having to discard material that had spoiled due to improper salting. It was household accounting applied to the unthinkable. Crawford also found correspondence between Martha and a butcher in a distant town, letters in which she offered special game meat at reduced prices. The butcher, apparently unsuspecting, had purchased occasional shipments over the years, distributing the product to local customers. The revelation that the contamination had spread beyond the McCallisters' property, that innocent people in distant communities had unwittingly participated in the horror, added another layer of trauma to the discovery. At the back of the barn, partially hidden behind bales of old hay, was an area that appeared to have been used for final disposal. The ground there was different, darker, saturated with substances that had seeped into the earth over the years. Daniels ordered them to begin digging, and a few feet down they found additional evidence that corroborated everything they had already uncovered. They weren't complete discoveries. The McCallisters had been too efficient for that, but enough fragments to confirm the fate of multiple victims. As the search of the barn continued, the 2 deputies who had been guarding Samuel and Martha reported that they remained completely silent. They didn't try to flee, didn't call for lawyers, didn't plead their innocence. They simply stood there side by side, surveying the barn with blank expressions, as if they already knew their reign of terror had finally come to an end. When Daniels emerged from the barn with Martha's notebooks in hand, Samuel simply closed his eyes slowly, a silent admission of defeat. Martha, however, kept her eyes open and fixed on the sheriff. There was no remorse in that look, no fear, no guilt, only a cold assessment, perhaps calculating their chances of escape or simply accepting the inevitable. As Daniels approached to formally arrest them, she finally spoke, her high-pitched voice cutting through the tense morning silence. She said only one thing, a sentence that would be recorded in the criminal records of Greenbrier County and haunt all who heard it for the rest of their lives. She said they wasted nothing, that survival in the mountains required utilizing every available resource, and that they had simply been more practical than others dared to be. The arrest of Samuel and Martha McCallister was carried out without resistance. Daniels placed heavy irons on both their wrists, and the pair were escorted to a wagon that would take them back to Lewisburg. During the entire journey, which took nearly 4 hours due to the rugged terrain, neither of them said another word. Samuel stared at the floor of the wagon, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of his crimes were finally crushing him. Martha, on the other hand, held her head high, watching the passing mountains as if memorizing every detail of a landscape she knew she would never see again as a free person. While the prisoners were being transported, Daniels left 3 men on the property to continue the investigation and protect the evidence. Jacob Weber and 2 deputies spent the rest of that day documenting each discovery, meticulously inventorying all the belongings found and photographing what they could with an antique camera they had brought from Lewisburg. The process was exhausting, not only physically, but emotionally. Each new item discovered represented a life interrupted, a family that had waited in vain for the return of a loved one. News of the arrest spread through Lewisburg with surprising speed. By the time the wagon arrived at the town jail at dusk, a crowd had already gathered in the streets. Men and women who had lost relatives or acquaintances in recent years, people who had always sensed something was wrong in this mountain region, all wanted to see the faces of those who had caused so much suffering. The atmosphere was tense, charged with barely contained anger. Daniels had to post extra guards around the jail to ensure no attempt at mob justice was made. The McCallisters were housed in separate cells in the jail's basement, a stone structure built decades earlier and designed to keep dangerous prisoners isolated from the rest of the community. Samuel was placed in a cell in the far corner, where daylight rarely reached. Martha was held in an adjacent cell separated only by a thick stone wall. Even so, guards reported that they could occasionally hear the two knocking on the walls in specific patterns, apparently communicating through some code they had developed over their years together. Judge Pembroke scheduled a preliminary hearing for 3 days later, enough time for the evidence to be organized and witnesses to be called. But he also knew he would need help prosecuting a case of this magnitude. There was no precedent in the history of Greenbrier County, perhaps in all of West Virginia, for crimes of this nature and scale. Pembroke sent urgent telegrams to Richmond, requesting the presence of experienced prosecutors and legal experts who could help build a case that would result in an unquestionable conviction. Meanwhile, families from across the eastern United States began converging on Lewisburg. When news of the discoveries on the McCallisters' property reached newspapers in larger cities, those with missing loved ones saw a terrifying possibility of finally getting answers. Eleanor Harrington, Thomas's widow, arrived from Richmond, accompanied by her 2 young sons. The family of a farmer named Benjamin Walsh traveled from Kentucky. A merchant named David Morrison, the brother of a man who had disappeared 3 years earlier, came from Pennsylvania. Each brought with them detailed descriptions, documents, anything that could help identify the belongings found on the property. The identification process took place in the courthouse, in a specially prepared room where the recovered belongings were displayed on long tables. The families were brought in one at a time, accompanied by an officer and a clerk who recorded each identification. It was a painful and necessary process. Eleanor Harrington immediately identified her husband's pocket watch, a piece that had belonged to his father and that Thomas always carried. She also recognized his wedding ring, still bearing the inscription they had had engraved 15 years earlier. When the clerk confirmed that these items were indeed among the evidence, Eleanor broke down in tears, finally receiving the horrific confirmation of her husband's fate. Story after story repeated itself. Benjamin Walsh's sister recognized a family Bible he always carried on his travels. David Morrison's brother identified a fraternal society badge his brother proudly wore. An elderly woman named Sarah Fletcher recognized a lace shawl she had handmade and given to her daughter before she set out on a journey west 2 years earlier. Her daughter had never reached her destination, and now Sarah knew why. Each identification was meticulously recorded, building a catalogue of victims that grew daily. Within 10 days, 21 victims had been confirmed through belongings identified by family members. 2 others were likely, but could not be definitively confirmed, because no one came forward to claim the belongings, or because the items were too generic to allow for positive identification. It was a devastating toll. 23 lives lost over 7 years, an average of more than 3 murders per year, and what made it all even more disturbing was the efficiency with which the McCallisters had operated, managing to keep their crimes hidden for so long, in a region where communities were small and gossip traveled quickly. The preliminary hearing finally took place on May 23, 1859. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with people crammed into the hallways and outside the windows, all eager to witness the beginning of the legal proceedings against the McCallisters. Samuel and Martha were brought in separately, both shackled and escorted by multiple guards. As they entered the courtroom, an angry murmur ran through the crowd, interrupted only by Judge Pembroke's gavel demanding order. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a man named Charles Whitmore, flown in from Richmond. Whitmore had a reputation for meticulousness and ruthlessness in criminal cases, and he had spent the last few days reviewing all the evidence collected. He presented the court with a devastating summary of his findings. Martha's notebooks with their detailed records, the identified belongings of 21 confirmed victims, the barrels of brine and their disturbing contents, the tools found in the barn, the wagons abandoned in distant ravines. Each item of evidence was presented methodically, building a case that seemed utterly unassailable. The McCallisters' defense was taken over by a local attorney named Henry Blackwood, a man who took the case not out of sympathy for the accused, but because he believed that even the worst criminals deserved proper legal representation. Blackwood knew he was fighting an impossible battle. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony consistent, and public opinion was completely against his clients. Still, he did his duty, arguing that much of what had been found was circumstantial, that the notebooks could be interpreted in multiple ways, and that no witness had actually seen the McCallisters commit any crime. But his arguments rang hollow even to himself. When Whitmore presented Jacob Webber's testimony about the suspicious nocturnal activities, when Eleanor Harrington testified emotionally about her husband's diary and its last entry mentioning the McCallisters' property, when the butcher in a neighboring town confirmed he had bought meat from Martha, without questioning its origin, the case became undeniable. Judge Pembroke ruled there was more than enough evidence to bring Samuel and Martha McCallister to trial on multiple counts of premeditated murder. The formal trial was scheduled to begin in July of that year, allowing time for more evidence to be gathered and for the defense to prepare its arguments, however futile they might be. But there was another reason for the delay. Authorities were still investigating the possibility of accomplices. Martha's records occasionally mentioned visitors who had helped with heavy tasks. There were cryptic references to a man about town who occasionally provided information about lone travelers carrying significant amounts of money. Daniels and his team expanded their investigation, seeking to identify whether others were involved in this web of horror. Meanwhile, the McCallisters' property became an object of morbid fascination. Despite authorities' efforts to keep it sealed off, curious people occasionally trespassed, wanting to see for themselves the site where so many atrocities had occurred. Some came out of unhealthy curiosity, others out of a genuine desire to understand how such evil could have flourished undetected. Jacob Webber, who knew the area well, was hired to guard the property, ensuring that no additional evidence was compromised before the trial. In the silence of their separate cells, Samuel and Martha McCallister awaited their fate. Guards reported that Samuel had become progressively more withdrawn, speaking less and less, and frequently refusing food. Martha, however, maintained her cool composure. She ate regularly, kept herself clean within the confines of the prison, and occasionally asked for writing materials. Judge Pembroke denied these requests, fearing she would attempt to communicate with possible accomplices still at large. The woman who had kept such meticulous records of her crimes was now isolated from paper and ink, forced to keep her thoughts to herself. The months between the preliminary hearing and the formal trial were marked by growing tension throughout the Appalachian region. The McCallisters' story had spread far beyond the borders of Greenbrier County, reaching newspapers in cities as far away as New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Reporters arrived weekly in Lewisburg, seeking interviews, additional details, any information that might feed the public's insatiable appetite for stories about the dark side of human nature. The case had become a national sensation, a terrifying example of what could happen in isolated regions of the country where the law had limited reach. Judge Pembroke established strict rules about what could and could not be published in newspapers before the trial. He feared that sensational coverage would compromise the ability to seat an impartial jury, though in his heart he knew that finding 12 men in West Virginia who had not formed opinions about the McCallisters would be virtually impossible. Still, he tried to maintain some level of decorum and due process, aware that the world was watching how justice would be served in this extraordinary case. Meanwhile, the investigation into possible accomplices continued. Sheriff Daniels had identified the man about town mentioned in Martha's notebooks. He was a Lewisburg innkeeper named Albert Crenshaw, a middle-aged man who worked in guest registration and had access to information about travelers passing through the area. When confronted, Crenshaw initially denied any involvement, But under prolonged questioning, he eventually confessed that he had occasionally provided information to the McCallisters about lone travelers carrying valuable goods or significant sums of money. Crenshaw claimed he thought he was simply helping the McCallisters identify potential clients for their inn. He swore he had no knowledge of the crimes being committed and was horrified to learn the truth. His story was plausible but also too convenient. Daniels arrested him as an accomplice, and Crenshaw was held in a separate cell awaiting his own trial. The discovery of his involvement, even if peripheral, added another layer of complexity to the case and raised disturbing questions about how many other people might have inadvertently contributed to the McCallisters' crimes. The search of the property also continued throughout these months. Teams of investigators systematically excavated various areas of the grounds, looking for additional evidence that might have been buried. They expanded their excavations beyond the barn, exploring areas of the surrounding woods where Jacob Weber had noticed signs of soil disturbance. In an oak grove approximately 300 yards from the main house, they found an area where something had clearly been buried and subsequently removed. The soil had a different composition, darker and more compact than the surrounding soil. They brought in sniffer dogs from a nearby town, trained to detect specific odors even after a long time. The dogs responded strongly to several areas of the ground, indicating locations where evidence had been present. Although much of the material had been removed or destroyed by the McCallisters in their attempt to eliminate traces, fragments still remained, buried deep or hidden in rock crevices they had been unable to reach. Each new discovery was catalogued, adding weight to the already overwhelming case against the couple. During this time, Martha McCallister made a surprising request. Through her attorney, Henry Blackwood, she requested permission to make a written statement about the events. Blackwood strongly advised against it, knowing that anything she said would only further undermine her defense. But Martha insisted, claiming she wanted to clear up certain misunderstandings about her actions. Judge Pembroke, curious but cautious, allowed her to write under strict supervision, on the condition that any statement would be immediately shared with the prosecution. The document Martha produced over several days was simultaneously revealing and deeply disturbing. She did not deny the crimes, but contextualized them in a way that demonstrated a complete lack of remorse or moral understanding. Martha wrote that she and Samuel had arrived in the Appalachian region with little more than the clothes they were wearing, fleeing debts in the east. They had tried to live honestly, but life in the mountains was brutal, especially during the winters when food was scarce and the isolation stifling. According to Martha, it had all started almost by accident. A traveler had died naturally on their property during a particularly severe snowstorm in the winter of 1852. They had been isolated for weeks, unable to transport the body to the city for a proper burial. Facing increasing hunger and no other options, they had made a decision that, in her words, was simply practical. From that moment on, something had changed in both of them. The line between survival and crime, between necessity and opportunity, had become irreversibly blurred. Martha described how the first intentional act had occurred months later, when a particularly rude and unpleasant merchant had insulted Samuel and tried to leave without paying for his hospitality. Samuel had reacted violently, and when the man was dead, they were faced with the same choice again. But this time there were also the merchant's valuable belongings, goods that could be sold, money that could sustain his estate for months. The rationalization had been too easy. What followed was a gradual progression from opportunistic crime to planned operation. They had developed methods, refined techniques, established procedures that minimized risk. Martha kept records to ensure they didn't make mistakes, that they didn't catch travelers who would be immediately wanted, that they spaced incidents out enough to avoid obvious patterns. It was crime transformed into routine, almost menial work performed with the same attention to detail that another person might apply to gardening or sewing. Martha's statement expressed neither guilt nor regret. Instead, there was a strange mixture of pride in her efficiency and resentment at having been captured. She seemed genuinely perplexed by the horror her actions inflicted on others. To her, they had simply been practical, doing what was necessary to survive and eventually thrive in a hostile environment. That others found her actions monstrous seemed to be a failure of understanding on their part, not hers. When Charles Whitmore read the statement, he knew immediately he had a powerful weapon for the prosecution. Martha had essentially confessed everything, providing details that corroborated the physical evidence and filled in gaps in the chronology of the crimes. She had done exactly what Blackwood had feared, condemned herself with her own words. The defense attorney was visibly shaken when he read the document, realizing that any hope of arguing mitigating circumstances or questioning his client's sanity had evaporated. Martha McCallister was clearly rational, calculating, and completely devoid of conventional moral conscience. Samuel, on the other hand, made no statement. He had almost completely withdrawn, spending entire days in absolute silence in his cell. Guards reported that he would often sit in the darkest corner, staring at the stone wall as if he could see through it to some distant place. He would occasionally mumble unintelligible words, but he never responded directly when asked questions. A doctor was called in to assess his mental state and concluded that Samuel was conscious and capable of participating in his own judgment, but that he had apparently chosen a form of psychological withdrawal as a coping mechanism. As July approached and the trial date loomed, Lewisburg prepared for what would arguably be the most significant event in its history. Hotels and guest houses were packed with journalists, victims' families, curious visitors from distant states, and lawyers eager to observe what promised to be a defining case in American criminal jurisprudence. The courtroom had been expanded with additional seating, but it still couldn't accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. Pembroke established a lottery system to determine who would occupy the available public seats, attempting to maintain some semblance of order and justice. The city streets took on an almost festive atmosphere, albeit tinged with morbidity. Street vendors sold pamphlets with sensationalized illustrations of the crimes, though many of these pamphlets were deliberately inaccurate or exaggerated. Itinerant preachers used the case as an example in their sermons on the nature of sin and redemption. There was even a theater troupe that had prepared a play dramatizing the events, though Judge Pembroke banned it from being performed until after the trial was concluded. At the center of all this attention, isolated in their stone cells, Samuel and Martha McCallister waited. They would be tried together, facing multiple counts of premeditated murder, each carrying the possibility of the death penalty. West Virginia law in 1859 was clear about crimes of this magnitude. If convicted, and few doubted they would face the gallows in a public execution that would surely draw even larger crowds than the trial itself. The trial of Samuel and Martha McCallister began on July 15, 1859, in a stifling heat that seemed to amplify the already palpable tension in the courtroom. The red brick building where justice would be administered had been built only a decade earlier, but it had never witnessed anything comparable to what was about to unfold. All the windows were open in the hope of catching a breeze, but the air remained thick and still, thick with sweat, nerves, and anticipation. The jury had been selected with considerable difficulty. Of an initial group of 60 men summoned from across Greenbrier County, only 12 could convincingly claim not to have formed strong opinions about the case. They were mostly farmers and merchants from remote mountain areas, men who rarely came to town and who had heard only fragments of the story through third-hand accounts. Prosecutor Whitmore and defense attorney Blackwood spent 3 days questioning candidates before arriving at a panel they both found acceptable, though neither was completely satisfied. When Samuel and Martha were brought into court that first morning, a complete silence fell over the crowded courtroom. The couple was shackled, but had been allowed to wear clean clothes provided by charitable members of the community, who, despite their horror at the crimes, still felt that even the worst criminals deserved some basic dignity during their trial. Samuel wore dark wool trousers and a simple linen shirt, while Martha wore an unadorned grey dress that made her appear even thinner and more ghostly than usual. Judge Pembroke opened the proceedings with a solemn address on the importance of justice and the need to maintain decorum, despite the disturbing nature of the case. He warned the audience that any emotional displays would result in immediate removal from the courtroom and possible contempt charges. His normally gentle voice carried an iron authority that made it clear he would maintain order at any cost. Satisfied that his instructions had been understood, he motioned for Whitmore to begin his opening statement. The prosecutor rose slowly, allowing the moment to linger. He was a tall, thin man with carefully combed-back grey hair and piercing eyes that would sweep the jury as he spoke. Whitmore began not with the gruesome details of the crimes, but with the victims. He spoke of Thomas Harrington, the draper who had left a wife and children awaiting his return. He described Benjamin Walsh, the young, optimistic farmer on his way to Kentucky to start a new life. He mentioned Sarah Fletcher, the woman who had left to reunite with her fiancé out west and never made it to the altar. Each victim was humanized, transformed from a mere statistic into a real person with dreams, families, and futures brutally ripped away. Whitmore kept his language carefully controlled, avoiding descriptions that might be considered overly graphic, but making clear the magnitude of the loss the McCallisters had caused. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, building a devastating portrait of 23 lives cut short over 7 years of calculated crimes. Then Whitmore shifted his focus to the evidence. He explained to the jury that he would present testimony after testimony, document after document, each building an unassailable case against the defendants. He cited Martha's meticulous notebooks, the belongings identified by devastated families, the testimonies of witnesses who had noticed suspicious activity but hadn't grasped its significance until now. He promised to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Samuel and Martha McCallister were responsible for a series of premeditated murders motivated by greed and executed with cold-blooded planning. When Whitmore finally took his seat, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electrically charged. Many of the spectators had tears in their eyes, including several members of the jury who were clearly struggling to maintain professional composure. Judge Pembroke allowed a brief recess before calling Blackwood to present his opening statement. The defense attorney was in an impossible position, and he knew it. He couldn't deny the evidence, couldn't seriously question the perpetrators' identities, couldn't claim innocence in the face of written confessions and mountains of physical evidence. His only viable strategy was to try to humanize his clients, to present them as products of extreme circumstances, people who had been corrupted by the brutality of life in the isolated Appalachian mountains. Blackwood spoke of the hardships pioneers faced in remote regions, how isolation and the constant struggle for survival could warp moral perspectives. He suggested that Samuel and Martha were not born monsters, but ordinary people who had gradually descended into a darkness from which they could not escape. He urged the jury to consider not only the crimes themselves, but also the context in which they occurred, the psychological pressures that might have contributed to increasingly dire decisions. It was a weak argument, and Blackwood knew it. He could see in the jury's faces that his words did little to soften their revulsion. But it was his duty to present the best defense possible, and he fulfilled that obligation with professional dignity, even knowing he was essentially arguing against an impossible tide. When he finished, he sat next to Martha, who had listened with a completely neutral expression, as if they were discussing the weather, not her life and death. The remainder of that first week was devoted to the prosecution's presentation of evidence. Whitmore called witness after witness, methodically building his case. Sheriff Daniels testified about the investigation, describing the abandoned wagons, the hidden belongings, and the discoveries in the barn. Jacob Weber recounted his observations of suspicious nighttime activities over the years. The doctor who had examined the evidence provided expert testimony about what had been found, keeping his language clinical and courtroom appropriate. Eleanor Harrington was one of the most powerful witnesses. She ascended the dais dressed in full mourning, holding her late husband's pocket watch in trembling hands. In a voice that occasionally cracked but remained strong, she read excerpts from Thomas's diary, including that final entry where he mentioned his arrival at the McCallisters' estate and his inexplicable hesitation about accepting hospitality there. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, and even Judge Pembroke had to pause the proceedings for a few minutes to regain his composure. Family after family testified, identifying belongings, sharing the last communications they had received from their loved ones, describing the agony of years of uncertainty that had finally been replaced by terrifying confirmation. Each testimony added another layer of humanity to the victims, transforming them from names on a list to real people whose absences had left permanent holes in countless lives. The second week of the trial began with the presentation of Martha's notebooks. Whitmore had carefully selected passages that demonstrated premeditation and planning without including overly disturbing details. He read passages that showed how Martha had catalogued her victims, assessed their belongings, and planned the ideal moment to strike. Her words, cold and calculating, spoke for themselves. There was no madness here, no uncontrolled passion, just crime treated as business. When it was Albert Crenshaw's turn to testify, he was visibly terrified. He had been offered a deal by the prosecution in exchange for his full and honest testimony. Crenshaw admitted to providing the McCallisters with information about lone travelers passing through Lewisburg, but repeatedly swore that he thought he was simply helping direct customers to the inn. He claimed to have been horrified to learn the truth. His testimony established that the McCallisters had operated with some level of planning and intelligence about their potential victims, further strengthening the argument of premeditation. Throughout this time, Samuel remained in near catatonic silence, rarely looking up from the table in front of him. Martha, on the other hand, watched each witness with intense attention, occasionally jotting notes on a piece of paper Blackwood had provided. Her demeanor was disconcerting to many observers. She didn't seem like someone facing trial for her life, but rather someone watching an academic proceeding of only moderate interest. By the end of the second week, the prosecution rested its case. Whitmore had presented such overwhelming evidence that any hope of acquittal seemed utterly impossible. Judge Pembroke asked Blackwood if the defense wished to present witnesses or evidence. The attorney hesitated, knowing he had few options. He could call Samuel or Martha to testify in his own defense, but Samuel was clearly incapable of giving a coherent testimony, and Martha, despite her articulation, would likely only further undermine his case with her apparent lack of remorse. Blackwood decided to present only a closing argument without additional witnesses. It was a tacit admission of defeat, but also a pragmatic decision. There was nothing the defense could present that would change the fundamental facts of the case. Henry Blackwood's closing argument was an exercise in dignified futility. He spoke for just over an hour, attempting to appeal to the jury's compassion without denying the undeniable realities of the crimes committed. His strategy was to acknowledge guilt while trying to avoid the death penalty, arguing that life imprisonment would be a sufficient and more humane punishment than execution. He spoke of the capacity for redemption, of how even the most lost souls could find repentance if given time. It was an eloquent argument, but it lacked real conviction, and everyone in the courtroom could sense it. When Blackwood mentioned the possibility of repentance, Martha did something unexpected. She stood abruptly, ignoring her attorney's protests, and asked for permission to speak. Judge Pembroke was visibly surprised, as was Whitmore. It was highly irregular to allow a defendant to speak directly during closing arguments, but Pembroke, after a moment of deliberation, decided to allow it. He warned Martha that anything she said would be used against her, but she simply nodded, showing she fully understood the consequences. Martha walked to the front of the courtroom with firm steps, her chains jingling softly. She stood there for a long moment, her eyes sweeping over the jury, the spectators, the victims' families seated in the front rows. Then she began speaking in that high-pitched, strangely childlike voice that contrasted so disturbingly with her words. She offered no apologies. She didn't plead for mercy. Instead, Martha spoke of survival, of how the rules of civilized society didn't truly apply in the isolated mountains where only the strong and practical could persist. She said that she and Samuel had done what was necessary, that they had turned circumstance into opportunity, and that if others found this monstrous, it was because they had never faced true necessity. She spoke for perhaps 15 minutes, and with each word she uttered, the horror in the courtroom only grew. What made her speech so deeply disturbing wasn't anger or delirium, but cold rationality. Martha genuinely didn't understand why her actions were considered so appalling. To her, they had simply been efficient, practical, even creative in their approach to the challenges of mountain life. She concluded by saying she had no regrets, that she would make the same choices again if faced with the same circumstances, and that the true hypocrisy lay in people judging her actions while living comfortably in cities, shielded from the real brutality of existence. When Martha finished and returned to her seat, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even Blackwood seemed in shock, realizing that his client had just sealed her own fate. She had not only confessed again, but had demonstrated a complete lack of humanity or moral conscience. Any hope of leniency that might have existed in the jurors' hearts evaporated in that moment. Charles Whitmore rose for his closing argument, but found he had little to add. Martha had done his job better than he could have. He spoke briefly about justice, about the need to protect innocent travelers, about sending a clear message that such crimes would not be tolerated under any circumstances, no matter how remote or difficult the living conditions. He asked the jury to return guilty verdicts on all counts and to recommend the maximum sentence allowed by law. Judge Pembroke instructed the jury on the applicable law, explaining the standards of proof and the various charges the McCallisters faced. He emphasized that even in cases where emotions ran high, justice required careful deliberation based on facts and law, not anger or revenge. His instruction lasted nearly 2 hours, meticulously covering every legal aspect of the case. Finally, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on July 28, 1859, the jury retired to begin their deliberations. Many expected the jury to take at least several days to reach a verdict, given the magnitude of the case and the number of charges. But just 3 hours later, a messenger emerged from the jury room, informing them that they had reached a decision. The speed of the deliberations surprised even Pembroke, who quickly ordered everyone back into the courtroom. The news spread like wildfire through Louisburg, and within half an hour, the courtroom was once again packed to capacity. Samuel and Martha were brought back into the courtroom under heavy guard. Samuel seemed even more withdrawn, if that were possible, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an unbearable physical weight. Martha, on the other hand, stood erect, her face a mask of coldness that revealed nothing of what she might be feeling inside. As the jury entered, none of the 12 men looked in the defendant's direction, a sign that experienced lawyers immediately recognized as a sign of a guilty verdict. The jury foreman, an elderly farmer named Thomas Whitaker, rose at the judge's request. His hand trembled slightly as he held the paper on which the verdict had been recorded. In a voice that began weakly but gradually gained strength, he read the verdicts. Guilty of premeditated murder in the death of Thomas Harrington. Guilty of premeditated murder in the death of Benjamin Walsh. Guilty of premeditated murder in the death of Sarah Fletcher. The litany continued. 23 guilty verdicts, one for each identified victim. The courtroom remained silent throughout the reading, but when the final verdict was pronounced, a collective sigh ran through the room. Some of the victims' families began to cry, not out of sadness but out of relief that finally, after years of uncertainty and pain, justice was being achieved. Others remained silent, processing the reality that although guilty verdicts were forthcoming, nothing could bring back those they had lost. Judge Pembroke thanked the jury for their service and then turned his attention to the convicted men. He scheduled the sentencing hearing for 3 days later, allowing time to prepare the appropriate documentation and allow both sides to present arguments regarding the appropriate punishment. Under West Virginia law, there was little doubt about the sentence for crimes of this magnitude, but due process had to be followed properly. During these 3 days of waiting, Louisburg remained in a state of heightened tension. There were heated discussions in the saloons on the streets and in the taverns about whether the death penalty was appropriate. The overwhelming majority of the population believed it was, that such horrendous crimes warranted the maximum punishment. But there were minority voices, particularly some religious leaders, who argued against taking the lives of even confessed murderers, citing teachings on forgiveness and the sanctity of all human life. Martha spent these final days in her cell, writing furiously on pages. The guards provided her under supervision. No one knew exactly what she was recording, whether it was a more complete confession, memories of her life, or simply reflections on her impending fate. Samuel, on the other hand, had completely stopped eating. The guards tried to force him to drink at least water, worried that he might die before facing his formal sentence, but he resisted passively, letting the liquids dribble from his mouth without swallowing. On the morning of August 1st, 1859, Samuel and Martha McCallister were brought into court for the last time. Both were visibly weaker, Samuel especially looking almost ghostly after days without adequate food. Judge Pembroke entered with a somber expression, the weight of his responsibility clearly on his shoulders. He had spent the previous nights in prayer and contemplation, though he knew there was only one sentence that the law and justice allowed. Pembroke first asked if the condemned men had anything to say before the sentence was pronounced. Samuel remained silent, staring at the ground. Martha, surprisingly, also chose not to speak. She simply shook her head, perhaps finally recognizing that her earlier words had only hurt her cause. Blackwood also offered no further arguments, knowing it would be futile. The judge then pronounced the sentence. Samuel McCallister and Martha McCallister would be hanged to death for their crimes against humanity and the laws of West Virginia. The execution would take place on August 30th of that year, at noon, in the Louisburg public square, according to the customs of the time. Pembroke spoke at length about the gravity of the crimes, about the need for justice not only for the victims, but for society as a whole, about how such acts could not be tolerated under any circumstances. When he finished, He banged his gavel one last time, and the condemned men were led back to prison. The dates had been set, justice would take its final course, and the community would begin the process of trying to understand how such evil had flourished undetected for so long. The final days of August 1859 hung over Louisburg like a dark, inescapable cloud. The town had become a gathering point for thousands of people from across the Appalachian region and beyond. Public executions were commonplace back then, seen not only as justice being served, but also as solemn warnings to would-be criminals. However, the McCallisters case had captured the public imagination so intensely that the crowd expected to witness their execution promised to be one of the largest ever assembled in West Virginia. Authorities began preparing the city's central square days before the scheduled date. A wooden structure was erected specifically for the occasion, built by local carpenters under the supervision of Sheriff Daniels. The platform was simple but solid, designed to support the weight of multiple people and equipped with the necessary mechanisms for 2 simultaneous executions. Guards were stationed around the square to maintain order and ensure the crowd didn't become uncontrollable. Martha McCallister spent her final days in a state of unnerving calm. She had completed her final writings and handed them over to Henry Blackwood with specific instructions that they be kept sealed for 50 years after her death. The lawyer reluctantly accepted, unsure what to do with documents that likely contained additional confessions or reflections that could be even more disturbing than anything already revealed. Martha also requested and received visits from a local minister, though those who spoke with him later reported that she showed no genuine repentance, only intellectual curiosity about concepts of redemption and the afterlife. Samuel, on the other hand, continued his physical and mental decline. He had completely stopped speaking, communicating only through minimal gestures when absolutely necessary. A doctor examined him and declared that although he was weak from lack of nutrition, he was still physically capable of facing execution. There was something deeply tragic about his condition, as if the magnitude of his crimes had finally broken something fundamental in his psyche. He seemed already gone, leaving only an empty shell awaiting his formal end. On the eve of the execution, Judge Pembroke paid a final visit to the condemned men. It was a courtesy he felt was necessary, a final opportunity for any additional confessions or pleas for clemency, though he knew no pardon would be forthcoming. He visited Samuel first, finding the man lying on his cot, staring at the stone ceiling with eyes that seemed to see nothing. Pembroke spoke words of spiritual comfort, but Samuel gave no sign of even hearing him. The visit to Martha was different. She sat upright on her cot, her hands folded in her lap, her posture almost serene. When Pembroke entered, she greeted him politely and even offered what could be interpreted as a smile. The judge asked if there was anything she wished to say, some final confession or request. Martha thought for a long moment before answering. She said she understood that society needed to punish her, that it made sense within the context of civilization's rules, but she reiterated that, in her own understanding, she had simply done what was necessary. There was no hatred in her words, no defiance, only a strange acceptance of incompatible fates, her own and that of the world that judged her. Pembroke left prison that night feeling deeply disturbed. He had presided over many criminal trials in his long career, had sentenced men to death before, but he had never encountered anyone quite like Martha McCallister. She wasn't insane in the traditional sense, not driven by passion or uncontrolled emotion. She was simply empty, where there should have been a moral conscience, an absence that was somehow more terrifying than any active evil. The morning of August 30th dawned clear and warm, the kind of summer day that would normally be perfect for harvesting crops or family picnics. But on this particular day, the beautiful weather seemed grotesquely inadequate for the events that were about to unfold. People began gathering in the central square before sunrise, wanting to secure the best spots to witness the action. By noon, the crowd had grown to perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 people, an extraordinary number for a city the size of Louisburg. Families of the victims were given reserved seats near the platform. Eleanor Harrington stood there dressed in black, her face pale but composed. Benjamin Walsh's brothers were present, as were dozens of others who had lost loved ones to the McCallisters' crimes. There were also onlookers, newspaper reporters from distant cities, artists sketching illustrations to be published in pamphlets and periodicals, and even street vendors circulating through the crowd offering water and food. At precisely noon, a nearby church bell began to toll, marking the hour. Guards brought Samuel and Martha from the prison in a covered wagon, escorted by mounted deputies, to ensure no rescue or lynching attempts occurred. The crowd fell eerily silent as the condemned men appeared, all eager to see the faces of those who had committed such unthinkable crimes. Samuel had to be practically carried to the platform, his legs barely able to support him. 2 guards supported him on either side, guiding him up the wooden steps. Martha, in contrast, walked with firm steps and head held high, her chains clanking but her movements determined. When she reached the top of the platform, she looked at the gathered crowd with those piercing eyes, as if trying to memorize every face, every expression of horror and fascination. Sheriff Daniels formally read the sentences, his voice carrying across the quiet square. He detailed the crimes for which Samuel and Martha McCallister had been convicted, 23 premeditated murders over 7 years. He spoke of justice being served and the hope that such crimes would never occur again in this region. When he finished, the minister who had visited Martha in prison offered final prayers, asking for divine mercy for the souls of the condemned and peace for the families of the victims. The executioners, men hired specifically for this task and whose identities were kept secret, positioned the condemned men under the prepared ropes. Black hoods were placed over their heads, a final mercy that would spare the crowd from seeing their final expressions. Samuel did not resist, completely passive until the last moment. Martha remained erect, and those nearby swore they heard her mutter something beneath the hood, words no one could clearly make out. As the mechanisms were activated and the trapdoors opened, a collective gasp ran through the crowd. It was a strange sound, a mixture of horror, satisfaction, relief, and sadness. Justice had been served according to the laws of the time, but there was something deeply disturbing about witnessing the end of human lives, no matter how terrible their crimes. Some in the crowd prayed, others averted their eyes, still others watched intently, as if compelled to witness every moment. The bodies were left hanging for the legally prescribed time before being removed and delivered for burial. There was no formal religious service, no headstone marking their graves. Samuel and Martha McCallister were buried in an unconsecrated area on the outskirts of Lewisburg, their final resting places marked only by simple, uninscribed stones. It was as if the community wished to erase their existence from the collective memory, even though everyone knew the story of their crimes would persist for generations. In the days and weeks that followed, Lewisburg slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy. The reporters departed, the crowds dispersed, and the victims' families returned to their distant homes to try to rebuild lives that had been irrevocably altered. The McCallisters' property was eventually burned by order of authorities, deemed too contaminated to be inhabited again. The barn, the house, and every structure were reduced to ashes, and nature gradually reclaimed the land. Jacob Weber, who knew those mountains better than anyone, occasionally passed through the area in the years that followed. He reported that even decades later, the area retained an eerie quality, as if the land itself held a memory of what had happened there. Travelers unfamiliar with the history sometimes commented on feeling inexplicably uneasy, passing through that particular valley, an uneasiness they couldn't name, but that made them quicken their pace and glance nervously at the shadows between the trees. Albert Crenshaw, the informant who had provided information to the McCallisters, served a 5-year prison sentence as an accomplice. Upon his release, he left West Virginia and was never seen in the region again. Records suggest he changed his name and attempted to start a new life somewhere out west, forever haunted by his role, however peripheral, in one of the most disturbing crime sprees in American history. The McCallisters' case had repercussions that extended far beyond Lewisburg and Greenbrier County. It led to changes in laws regarding backcountry inns and lodges, with new registration requirements and periodic inspections. It spurred discussions about how to better protect travelers in isolated regions and the need for a stronger law enforcement presence in frontier areas. And it became a cautionary tale, a story whispered around campfires and told to travelers venturing into the Appalachian Mountains, a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from wild animals or natural accidents, but from the darkness that can lurk within the human heart. Today, more than a century and a half later, the McCallisters' story remains one of the darkest narratives in American criminal history. It reminds us of a time when vast swathes of the country were truly wilderness, where the law had limited reach and where people could disappear without a trace. But more profoundly, it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil. how extreme circumstances can corrupt individuals, and the fragility of the moral structures that hold civilization together when pushed beyond certain limits. Martha McCallisters' notebooks, sealed as instructed, were eventually opened in 1909. They contained additional confessions, details about victims who had never been identified, and disturbing philosophical reflections on morality and survival. The documents were quickly resealed and remain in restricted archives to this day, deemed too disturbing for general public access. They are a final testament to a mind that operated completely outside the normal parameters of human empathy. The Appalachian Mountains hold many secrets within their deep folds and secluded valleys. The story of the McCallisters is just one of many dark narratives that have emerged from that region over the centuries, but it remains one of the most haunting, a reminder that true horror often comes not from supernatural forces or mythical creatures, but from the human capacity to rationalize the unthinkable when freed from the constraints of civilized society. If this story has made you reflect on the dark mysteries that still lurk in the forgotten corners of American history, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next cases we'll bring to light. Each week we delve into old archives, unearth secrets that time has tried to erase, and explore the darkest corners of the past. Leave a like if this story resonated with you, and tell us in the comments which aspect of this case deeply disturbed you. Until next time, we'll journey through the shadows of history,